Hello there, this is Senaris. I want to wish a happy 4th of July to all my fellow Americans out there. In the spirit of this holiday, I put together a tier list of every US president. I originally intended this to be a single video, but when the script reached 9 pages and I was only on Rutherford B. Hayes, I decided it would be better to make this into a series so that it's not a 2-hour-long video. My video about the Democrats letting Roe v. Wade get overturned pissed off a lot of liberals on Reddit, and so I thought I'd make a video that pisses off liberals and conservatives to set things right. As regular viewers of this channel know, I'm very far left politically, and so I'll try to apply some historical relativism so that not every president goes in the F tier. On the other hand, some things cannot be forgiven, and so this list will be much more harsh than other similar videos. I'm not going to pretend to be objective here. I have strong biases, and there are plenty of other videos on YouTube by right-wing historians who will claim that Reagan is objectively the best president ever if that's what you're looking for. I'd also like to explain the methodology I'm using here, because some people aren't familiar with tier lists. S tier is reserved only for the best of the best. Obviously, we've never had a president that did nothing wrong, but the S tier is reserved for presidents whose combination of leadership, improving the lives of normal people, and performance as head of state far outweigh their poor decisions. There won't be many of these. The C tier is for average presidents, whose good and bad policies and decisions are basically a wash. As you can guess, B tier is for better than average presidents, and A tier is for good but not great presidents. D tier will mostly be for less than average presidents and presidents that will mostly be ignored by history. F tier is for truly heinous presidents that were a blight upon this country and its people. I may also add special tiers for uniquely amazing or horrible presidents. With those disclaimers out of the way, let's begin. George Washington was the first president of the United States and the most famous general of the American Revolutionary War. He was one of the founding fathers and president of the Constitutional Convention, and so he had an important role in the writing of the U.S. Constitution. He was the only president to win an election unanimously in the Electoral College. He supported federalism and the ratification of the Constitution, but wasn't a formal member of the Federalist Party. In fact, he was directly opposed to political parties in general and is the only president that wasn't a member of one, as well as ignoring the infighting between his cabinet members Thomas Jefferson and Alexander Hamilton, which led the Federalist and Democratic Republican parties respectively. He set many of the norms of the presidency which exist to this day, such as serving 2 terms, the inaugural address, and the actual title of Mr. President, as opposed to some of the more monarchist titles suggested by Congress, such as His Excellency. Of course, we can't talk about the first president of a nation which promises the general welfare and securing blessings of liberty for its citizens without talking about the institution of slavery. I have no sympathy for the idea that slavery was a necessary evil of the times or that people didn't know better. The abolition movement in the British colonies started almost 100 years before the Revolutionary War, and even the French were passing laws against slavery as early as 1315. Washington owned hundreds of slaves during his life, and while according to some accounts he privately sympathized with abolition, he avoided the topic in public because he knew it would be politically divisive. It's worth noting that during his time as president, he rotated his slaves between the capital in Philadelphia and his home in Virginia to get around a Pennsylvania law that freed slaves who lived there for at least 6 months. On a personal note, I've been to Washington's home at Mount Vernon, where I saw the slave quarters and Washington's mansion, and I can tell you the discrepancy between the two is not what you would expect from a man opposed to slavery. While my first impulse is to put every president who owned slaves or was sympathetic to the institution of slavery in F tier, and if you stick around you will see that most of them belong there are some unique considerations with Washington and some of the other founding fathers, particularly from a socialist perspective. He was the leader of a revolution which overthrew a monarchical rule, advancing the class struggle of the American proletariat and freeing them from tyranny forever. No, I'm just kidding. He was a slave-owning aristocrat, and the American Revolution was more of a change in management than a revolution. It didn't create democracy or liberate the American people, it just put some American capitalists in charge instead of some British ones. Democracy has never existed in the US, least of all when the only people who could participate in government at all were white land-owning men. Then we had 100 years of black people not being considered people, followed by 100 years of black people kind of being considered people but being killed for trying to vote. White women were given the right to vote 100 years ago, and the Voting Rights Act passed in 1965, only to be gutted in 2013 because John Roberts decided racism was over. For perspective, all of those things happened within the current president's lifetime, and this system was set up by rich cunts like Washington. The bottom line is that the Founding Fathers did a shitty job of making a country based on establishing justice, ensuring domestic tranquility, providing for the common defense, promoting the general welfare, and securing the blessings of liberty to its people, and Washington and most of the Founding Fathers belong in F tier for it. Hail to the chief. John Adams was the first vice president, a political philosopher, and a founding father along with Washington. He was educated as a lawyer at Harvard and was important in the Revolution as a writer and diplomat. Adams was regarded as a reasonable man with great respect for the rule of law, going as far as defending British soldiers in murder cases after the Boston Massacre. He is elected as the first and only member of the Federalist Party. His administration is most notable for its handling of relations with the French, as the French Revolution was going on at the time, and also the Alien and Sedition Acts. During the Revolutionary period, France went to war with Britain, and most American citizens at the time were supportive of France due to their opposition to the British monarchy and because of the help lent by France during the American Revolution. The Federalist Party was more sympathetic towards the British monarchy because they thought the French revolutionaries were too radical and barbaric, while the Democratic Republicans stood against the monarchy and for the French Republic. During Adams' presidency, American support for France was weakened, largely due to a speech he gave in which he both announced a peace commission to France and a military buildup in case of war with France. This was worsened after what became as the XYZ affair, where negotiations with the French broke down. This eventually led to naval hostilities with the French in 1798. The Alien and Sedition Acts were passed to clamp down on dissent by French immigrants and included provisions increasing citizenship requirements and deportation authority by the president, as well as outlawing talking shit about the government. One congressman was sentenced to 4 months in jail for criticizing Adams. These acts were the most unpopular decisions of his presidency and likely led to his re-election defeat by his own vice president, Thomas Jefferson. It's worth noting that Adams and later his son John Quincy Adams both hated slavery and were the only people among the first 12 presidents that never owned slaves, and John Adams actually represented several slaves in court cases for their freedom. He was an important figure in the early days of the country and more enlightened than many of his presidential colleagues. The Alien and Sedition Acts suck, but compared to what some modern presidents get up to, like imprisoning people in black sites with no charges and torturing them for years.
We tortured some folks.
While he is somewhat forgotten among the Founding Fathers, I'd say he is a slightly better than average president and he belongs in the B tier. Thomas Jefferson is perhaps the second most famous and highly regarded of the Founding Fathers after Washington. He was the Renaissance man of the Founding Fathers with mastery of many disciplines including law, diplomacy, philosophy, math, and architecture, among others. Jefferson had a strong presidential resume, including Secretary of State under Washington, Vice President under Adams, Governor of Virginia, and chief author of the Declaration of Independence. As president, he was most famous for the Louisiana Purchase, the purchase of a vast stretch of land extending from New Orleans all the way to Montana from the French. Of course, the French controlled very little of that land, with the vast majority of it being home of various Native American tribes who were not consulted in the sale. This, of course, greatly ramped up what some historians and politicians of the time called Indian removal or forced displacement, but what normal people would call ethnic cleansing and genocide. What Jefferson viewed as his crowning achievement, extending the lands of the United States beyond the Mississippi River, nearly doubling the size of the country, directly led to the Trail of Tears and legal disputes over indigenous land rights that continue to this day, hundreds of years later. When he wasn't committing crimes against humanity, he was a big fan and reader of Enlightenment-era philosophy, which was popular at the time. Philosophers such as Berkeley, Hume, and especially Locke championed the individual right to life, liberty, and private property. Private property, such as half a continent you purchased from people who don't own it in any sense besides a capitalist legal one, and owning people. Despite his alleged belief in the importance of life and liberty and his regular denunciation of the institution of slavery, Jefferson owned over 600 slaves, more than any other president. Somehow, that isn't even the most hypocritical aspect of the man. When Haiti had a slave revolt and freed themselves from French rule and slavery, Jefferson supported the French in their plans to retake the island, loaned the French money to do so, and discouraged emigration by free black Americans to the country. To Jefferson, when rich white capitalists want to have a revolution to free themselves from other rich white capitalists across the pond because of taxation and a lack of democratic representation, that is a just and imperative thing to do. But when actual slaves have a revolution to free themselves from capitalists who own them as property, that is to be prevented at all costs. Due to his immense hypocrisy, his part in the genocide of the Native Americans, and his personal ownership of hundreds of human beings as property, this monstrous piece of shit goes straight to the F tier. Sorry if my voice sounds different in this part. I somehow missed recording the James Madison part of the script and am recording it now while getting drunk and editing the video. James Madison was another founding father and referred to as the father of the Constitution for his important part in writing and advancing the cause of the Constitution and Bill of Rights. He was a member of the House of Delegates in Virginia during the Revolutionary War, and his writings are some of the most important in the creation of the U.S. federal government. His Virginia plan would go on to provide the skeleton for the government, outlining the 3 separate branches of government and 2 legislative bodies in Congress, as well as proportional representation based on the population of the various states. He probably would not have been a big fan of the modern Senate, which gives outsized power to senators from states with small populations and its habit of halting legislation passed in the House and desired by the American people. Besides the Virginia plan, he, along with Alexander Hamilton, wrote many of the Federalist Papers, which are perhaps the most influential writings with regards to getting the American people on board with ratifying the Constitution and making some of the most important legal arguments in early American law, which shaped jurisprudence to this day. Madison oversaw the War of 1812, in which the Brits came back to spank the Yanks for misbehaving, capturing Washington, D.C. and lighting the White House and Capitol building on fire. Like Jefferson, he publicly derided the institution of slavery and the slave trade while also owning over 100 slaves, and also, like Jefferson, oversaw the annexation of tens of millions of acres of Native American land. While not as bad as Jefferson, he was a slave owner who continued the genocide of the Native Americans, causing untold amounts of death and human misery, and belongs in the F tier. James Monroe was another founding father from Virginia that worked as a diplomat before his election to the presidency. He was a strong ally to Jefferson during his term, personally working on the Louisiana Purchase negotiations as well as Secretary of War during the War of 1812. His connections and roles within the previous 2 presidencies gave him an advantage, and he won his election in a landslide. He is best known for the Monroe Doctrine, which was the U.S. position that European colonization in the Americas was a hostile act. European colonization bad, American colonization good. This doctrine continued into the 20th century and is sometimes invoked even to this day. Monroe also oversaw the Missouri Compromise, adding Missouri as a slave state and Maine as a free state, and banning slavery in the lands north of Missouri except for Missouri. This compromise is one of the many half-assed attempts to reconcile the relations of slave states in the South and free states in the North, and would later contribute to the Civil War. Like all the presidents before him, besides Adams, he condemned slavery while also owning a bunch of slaves, never freeing any of them during or after his lifetime, and directly participated in the Louisiana Purchase and subsequent ethnic cleansing. F tier. John Quincy Adams was the first president that wasn't from Virginia or a founding father, being the son of John Adams, the second president. Like many other presidents, he worked as a diplomat and lawyer before becoming president, serving as ambassador to many countries, including the Netherlands, Russia, and Prussia. As president, he had a bold agenda which included federal infrastructure projects, establishing a national university, and reaching out to Latin American countries, but Congress held up much of his plan. During his presidency, the war hero Andrew Jackson became increasingly popular, and the Democratic-Republican Party broke into 2 parties based on support for Adams and Jackson, the National Republican Party and the Democratic Party respectively. Yes, that Democratic Party, whose establishment in 1828 makes it the oldest political party in the world. Jackson's popularity and the effective organizing of the Democratic Party led to Adams' defeat in his re-election campaign. Adams wasn't done with life in Washington, however, and he went on to be the only former president to run for the House of Representatives and win, where he served until his death in 1848. In his time in Congress, he was very critical of slavery, the Democratic Party which supported slavery, and especially the annexation of Texas, which would extend slavery and make pro-slavery Democrats that much more powerful in Congress. While his convictions on slavery are commendable, and he was one of the greatest diplomats in early American history, he was somewhat of a weak and unpopular president, unable to pass much of his agenda and losing his re-election, becoming only the 2nd president to do so. I consider him an average president, landing him in C tier. Okay, time for Andrew Jackson. Jackson was born poor but became very wealthy from being a slave-owning planter. He served in both the House and the Senate for Tennessee and later became an officer in the U.S. Army. He led troops in the Creek War, the Battle of New Orleans, and the First Seminole War, leading him to become a popular war hero. He ran for president in 1824, almost beating Adams, and the closeness and bitterness of the race led Jackson to form the Democratic Party, which would go on to defeat Adams in 1828. As president, he is most famous for his strong pro-slavery stance, not even pretending to be against the institution like most of his predecessors, as well as the Indian Removal Act, which forcibly removed most Native Americans from the South, leading to the Trail of Tears, an act of genocide that killed about 60,000 Native Americans. Jackson's presidency was also marked by cronyism, as what is now called the spoils system started under him, where a president nominates supporters, friends, and family to positions in their cabinet that continues to this day, as opposed to the more merit-based and bipartisan norms of early presidents, such as making the runner-up in a presidential election the vice president. Jackson is also famous for being the first president whom someone tried to assassinate, when a man named Richard Lawrence tried to shoot Jackson with a pistol which misfired, only to pull a second pistol and try again, only to have another misfire. Jackson attacked Lawrence with his cane, beating the shit out of him before others pulled Jackson away. Jackson remained a staunch enemy of the slavery abolition movement, which started becoming much stronger during his second term. He supported pro-slavery Democratic politicians even after his presidency, including future presidents Van Buren and Polk. Most presidents before Jackson had an important role in the continuation of slavery and Native American genocide, but Jackson took things further, being directly responsible for the deaths of thousands and the active resisting of abolition for his entire life. For being a uniquely reprehensible monster, Andrew Jackson is the first president to get their own tier below F tier. Congratulations! Now the next few presidents are some of the most forgotten and unpopular presidents, so I'm going to bang them out in a lightning round. Martin Van Buren was the 8th president, being the first president born after the American Revolution and the only one to speak English as a second language. He oversaw the Panic of 1837, a major financial crisis, continued Jackson's Indian Removal Act, which led to the Second Seminole War, and became very unpopular due to his refusal to add Texas as a state, which pissed off his own party to the point where he couldn't even win the Democratic primary in his re-election campaign. He formed a new party and lost. D tier. William Henry Harrison was a military officer that served in several Indian wars. He became the Whig Party nominee for president in 1840, winning the election and becoming one of the only members of that party to win the presidency. At his inauguration, a particularly cold and rainy day, he delivered a 2-hour speech, the longest inaugural address in history, and then rode around Washington in a parade for a few more hours, kissing hands and shaking babies. He developed pneumonia and died 3 weeks later. He didn't do anything important in his brief presidency. D tier. John Tyler, Harrison's vice president, became the 10th president after Harrison's death. He was a big states' rights guy, sympathetic to the slave states, and a big fan of Manifest Destiny. He supported the rights of slaveholders and the expansion of slavery. At the end of his presidency, he annexed Texas, but isn't remembered for much else. F tier. James K. Polk was another Manifest Destiny guy, starting the Mexican-American War, an aggressive war with Mexico to settle the dispute of Texas, and annexing the Oregon Territory, which spread the borders of the U.S. to the west coast. He was another pro-slavery president that did nothing to prevent the approaching Civil War. He planned on freeing his slaves after the death of him and his wife, but they were freed by the Emancipation Proclamation before his wife's death. F tier. Zachary Taylor was a general in the army that became a war hero during the Mexican-American War and used that popularity to become president. He was enthusiastic in his imperialism and somewhat of a zealot in the war. He was on the fence about whether to make the southwestern states slave states or free states, leaving it up to them and further angering the southern slave states and exacerbating tensions. He owned over 300 slaves, more than any president besides Washington or Jefferson, and like most presidents in the era, did nothing to prevent the Civil War. He died 16 months into his presidency from a stomach disease. F tier. Millard Fillmore was the 13th president, taking office after the death of Zachary Taylor and becoming the last member of the Whig Party to be president. He is another mostly forgotten president, mostly known for the Compromise of 1850, another band-aid on the gushing wound that was the tensions between North and South over slavery. The Compromise settled disagreements over the western states and included the fugitive slave law mandating that escaped slaves be returned to their owners. Even though he was more vocal in his opposition to slavery than most presidents in the era and didn't own slaves himself, he was another president that did little to prevent the Civil War. D tier. Franklin Pierce was a Northern Democrat that was vehemently opposed to the abolition of slavery, signing the Kansas-Nebraska Act and enforcing the Fugitive Slave Act, leading to Bleeding Kansas, a series of armed conflicts and battles in those states. Our boy John Brown had had enough of this shit, and him and other abolitionists started raiding, assaulting, and leading slave rebellions in the Kansas Territory. This is when things really started to ramp up to the Civil War, and Pierce, like most presidents of this era, just let it happen. He was one of the worst presidents ever. F tier. James Buchanan was somehow an even worse president, championing the rights of slave states and not using the federal government to intervene in the now inevitable Civil War. He leaned on several Supreme Court justices in the Dred Scott decision, in which the court decided that people of African descent, regardless of whether they were free or slaves, were unable to gain American citizenship. The Supreme Court sucks today and probably always will, but this was the worst decision they ever made, and Buchanan helped make it happen. He pissed off the North by not stopping the South from seceding and pissed off the South from not helping them secede, and was just a horrible person in general. He also got no pussy and was the only president to never get married. He's a uniquely horrible president that more directly led to the Civil War than anyone in US history, and is the second president to get their own tier, even lower than Andrew Jackson. Okay, now we're finally out of the woods. Abraham Lincoln was a master statesman, savior of the Union, and one of the few American leaders that just about everyone, regardless of their political affiliation, views as one of, if not the best president of all time. Lincoln was born in a log cabin in Kentucky, later moving to Indiana with his family and teaching himself how to read and write, eventually becoming a self-taught lawyer. He rose up in the Whig Party to become a leader, then a legislator in the Illinois state government, and eventually a congressman. He later joined the newly formed Republican Party and gained prominence from his participation in what would later be called the Lincoln-Douglas debates. These debates were between Lincoln and Stephen Douglas, who were both vying for a U.S. Senate seat in Illinois. The debates became a media spectacle and the most thoroughly covered event in history by the country's newspapers. Some of the debates had well over 10,000 people in attendance, which is very impressive when you consider the population of the country was around 30 million at the time. The substance of the debates focused on slavery, with Douglas arguing it should be left to state and local governments rather than the federal government, and Lincoln arguing that there should be no new slave states, but didn't argue for abolition where it was already legal. In the end, Lincoln lost the election, but he built quite the reputation for his rhetorical skills despite being perceived as a common man, and the promotion of the new Republican Party and its platform. His new popularity propelled him to a successful presidential election campaign, defeating the Democrats and his old rival Douglas to become the 16th president. This election was incredibly divisive, however, as while he swept the northern and western states, he only won 2 of the 996 counties in the South. His election was the spark that lit the fuse of the brewing Civil War, as South Carolina, Florida, Mississippi, Alabama, Georgia, Louisiana, and Texas all seceded in the time between the election and Lincoln taking office, leading to the formation of the Confederate States of America. It's difficult to put in perspective just how threatening Lincoln was to the southern states and how hard they were willing to fight back against even the notion that the institution of slavery could be abolished, and even more difficult to try to imagine what sort of radical figure or law could trigger a response like that today. Imagine if Ilhan Omar, or AOC, became president in 2024 on a platform of abolishing the Supreme Court, undoing all their major decisions of the past 8 years legislatively, abolishing ICE and their concentration camps on the border, passing a constitutional amendment guaranteeing everyone housing, healthcare, and higher education as a human right that the government must provide, and closing all of our overseas military bases and cutting the military budget in half. What would happen? Some far-right militias would probably do some domestic terrorism, and it would definitely piss all the conservatives off, but would half the country try to wage a civil war? It may be a hot take, but I don't think so. Some may try, but no state militia, even combined ones, is going to be able to stand up to drones, strategic bombers, and nuclear submarines. Anyways, back to our boy Lincoln. The slave states started seceding after his election. Lincoln and Buchanan both say that's illegal and the Confederate states aren't a thing. The Confederates say fuck you and attack Fort Sumter, and the Civil War goes into full swing. At his inauguration, Lincoln repeats his belief that the president doesn't even have the authority to end slavery the way the southern states are afraid of, and that he doesn't intend to, but this does nothing to slow down the war or get the South to chill out. He tries several more measures to try to reach some sort of agreement, from compensating the slave states in exchange for abolition, which was rejected, to later banning slavery on federal territory and freeing slaves of people directly assisting the Confederacy. Eventually, Lincoln is moved on his position that preserving the Union is more important than ending slavery, realizing he can't do one without the other, and issues the Emancipation Proclamation, freeing all of the over 3 million slaves in the South and also allowing freed slaves to join the Union armed forces, which many did as the Union slowly advanced in the South. He had to say fuck you to the Supreme Court to issue the executive order, but it turns out that simply ignoring what the court says was a pretty effective way around them. Modern Democrats should take notes. Despite hitting somewhat of a stalemate in the war in the time before his re-election, Lincoln manages to get re-elected in 1864. Fun socialist fact here, Karl Marx and the First International were big fans of Lincoln and sent him a letter congratulating him for his re-election. Over the next year, Union forces advanced towards the Confederate capital in Richmond, Virginia, leading to the beginning of peace talks. The nearby city of Petersburg is encircled in a siege on April 1st of 1865 and the government is evacuated. A week later, on April 9th, General Lee of the Confederacy surrenders to General Grant of the Union, signaling an official end to the war. 5 days later, while attending a play, Lincoln is assassinated by John Wilkes Booth, a sympathizer of the Confederacy. The murder made Lincoln a martyr, and his funeral train from Washington, D.C. to his home in Springfield, Illinois stopped in many cities with hundreds of thousands of people visiting to pay their respects. Lincoln is remembered as the man who saved the Union, the father of the Republican Party, who still refer to themselves as the Party of Lincoln to this day, and the man who ended slavery. Lincoln was not a perfect man, and like many of the presidents before him, was hesitant to say the least about ending slavery, but unlike them, he actually faced the issue head-on and finally did start the process of ending it, culminating in the 13th Amendment. Lincoln is the greatest emancipatory figure in the history of the US, and for that, he is one of, if not the only, president that belongs in the S tier. Thanks for watching. Please like and subscribe, leave a comment about your favorite president, and stay tuned for part 2 of this series. Peace.